This is Choose the Bear, where we dive deep into the power and joy of living a vibrant, independent life on your own terms. This podcast is your go-to source for smart, fun, and insightful conversations about what it means to embrace independence and live the life you choose. I'm Kat Calvin, and together we'll explore how this movement is challenging outdated stereotypes, redefining success, and empowering people to live their best independent lives. Hello, everyone. So today we are talking to Dr. Kimya Nuru Dennis. She is an educator. She is a researcher. She's done some really interesting research on child-free people. She has a lot of expertise in pronatalism in the Black community, and just she knows a lot of things about a lot of things. And it was such an interesting conversation that I think you'll really enjoy. She is someone who I learned a lot from, and I think I could continue to learn a lot from. So I hope that you enjoy this interview. Well, hello, everyone. I am so excited for you to hear this interview because we're going to talk about some really interesting research. And I'm a big nerd, so I love the research episodes. And this one, I think, will not disappoint. I am here with Dr. Kimya Nuru Dennis, who is really fascinating. I'm not going to tell you all about her. She's going to tell you all about herself because it's too much for me to even try. But it's going to be really interesting. So sit back, unless you're driving, and then stay alert on the 10 and 3, 10 and 2, I guess. It's been a while since driver's ed. And Dr. Dennis, hello. Thank you so much for joining.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate you.
So please tell everyone who you are and what you do.
All right. So I am a sociologist and a criminologist. I am a professor, a researcher, and I do evaluations. I'm also a theorist, so I help our people understand theoretical creation, theoretical critique, and integration. And so I always put it as health, education, economics, because I specialize in health, education development, and economic development. And I also focus on community work. So as a professor, what I do is teach my student scholars how to put everything into communities outside of classrooms. And I also have more than 10 years of doing community resource tables in different cities, different states, local, national, and I also have global collaborations with doing that.
That's incredible. I definitely wrote down a couple of buzzwords you just mentioned that I want to talk about. But let's start first with the thing that first brought you to my attention, which is this study that you did in 2013 around Black child-free people. Can you tell us a little bit about what this study was, what you were looking for, and particularly what you found out?
Yeah, so thank you. So when I first started the study in 2013, it was because I knew that I was never having biological or adopted children, but I knew that most of the resources in terms of books, message boards, chat spaces were for a particular group of people. And the moment you bring up racial variance, ethnic variance, people would express outrage, like child-free is the same for everyone. And that's a very common method when talking about health, disability, anything. It's this, and even social class. It's the same for everyone. So how dare you people, especially Black people, mention racial variance? And that's a global issue, not just the United States of America. So that really motivated me. And that's when I started the Childfree research. And I appreciate that my academic program really supported my research. That's when I also created the course. And some of my students had children, wanted to have children, and some of my students were child-free. So when I started that research, I was anxious because we're talking about helping people to just find a space to speak about whatever they want to speak about. So I did open-ended items. Now, when I first started the research in 2013, you know how it is when you first start research, you're kind of doing experimental study.
Yeah.
And it takes about a few months of the research and speaking with people to see these are the topics that people want to really address. Personal experiences regarding mental health, issues such as mental illness that are on sides of the family. So they're feeling like if I reproduce, will that pass on to children? And other issues regarding Black child-free people, particularly child-free women. I also interviewed about 3 Black child-free men, one of whom was very honest and said, but I was not shocked. I was not at all shocked. But he did say that if he ends up marrying a woman who wants to have children, he'll do so.
Mm.
So that's when I publish this work, it's usually in publicly accessible writings because I want people to just find it anywhere, like on a blog or something like that. But I just want people to understand that when we talk about child-free Black people, there's a difficult balance because as Black women, we're told to just find a man, especially a Black man. And for the Black men who are child-free, they're very difficult to find because that's issues of Black men utilizing birth control, Black men finding women who are willing to be child-free, or if having children, they don't want the Black man to take care of the children. And also, I had a couple of Black women in my study who would be considered childless, meaning they would have wanted to have children, but now they're in their 50s, 60s, and they're like, well, that's off the equation now. And so those are just some findings and just a need to discuss this topic amongst our people and just bringing our people together, particularly Black women together who have these similarities was also interesting.
Yeah. So what, sort of starting at the top, what are some of the major differences in challenges or experiences that are faced by Black child-free women that are unique to our community versus others?
So a lot of times when you hear the term pronatalism, that's like this catch term that you hear a lot. But pronatalism does vary by race and ethnicity. As Africans, this humans in general believe that humans only exist to reproduce. And especially this notion that girls and women only exist to reproduce. So they don't even talk about issues of infertility. And then if you let them use stories like Adam and Eve, then you just kind of go and it's really difficult to have those kinds of discussions. So you would say that's even more when speaking with Africans, this issue of understanding birth controls have existed around the world for thousands of years. Unfortunately, a lot of our people as Africans believe that birth control was created someplace other than among Africans, and that we as a people did not consider reproductive choices, even before that terminology existed, until outsiders forced that on us. This falsehood that as Africans, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of years before it was a continent, after it was a continent, before it was forced into nations, and after we were forced into nations. We're talking about particularly millions of cultures, millions of spiritualities, religions. We're talking about African scientists, African laboratories, all types of things that we have as Africans, but somehow, unfortunately, many of our people think that we did not have these ideas of controlling our bodies, including controlling what we can produce from the bodies until outsiders told us to do so, which is also interesting because if you go into certain segments of our people and talk about birth control, many of our women will talk about natural birth control methods. So I always remind that to Africans who say, no, oppressors gave us that. And I say, actually, if you're in these African holistic spaces, you will hear about natural approaches to reproductive choices, just like you'll hear about natural approaches to childbirth. So that's the full span of hundreds of thousands of years of our people that a lot of our people don't want to understand the span of various cultures among Africans and how that shapes our lack of understanding of our people on the United States of America land. We have a full span, and that's why a lot of our people keep things secret. A lot of our people keep things secret. They keep it from their families. And that's one of the uncertainties. Even when people know they don't want to have children, there are some people who would consider themselves child-free, particularly Black women who would consider themselves child-free. However, if they go into a situation and boom, a baby happens, a baby just happens. So when I've done this presentation at conferences, whether it was a health conference, a medical conference, or a Black sociology conference, sometimes you would see that people are just shocked that Black women and even Black girls would have a conscious decision and then have the actions that go into it without claiming that people are forcing birth control or even forcing abstinence and celibacy on us to do it.
And where does that come from? And I'm particularly curious how much religion plays into this and how much a particular form of Black patriarchy plays into this situation where you have women and girls who either, as you say, decide to be child free and then it's like, oh oops, but here's a kid, which I think we've all seen, or who don't realize even from a ever, but really starting at an early age, that there is an option other than having children. And it's something we see, in so many different cultures. But particularly in Black culture, what do you think are the elements that really play into that from a sort of cultural, religious, day-to-day life experience?
Yeah, and this also happens to Black women who are in same gender relationships. So I remember probably like 7, 8 years ago when I presented this at the Association of Black Sociologists conference, a Black woman who's married to a Black woman came to me after my presentation and said that this is also their experience. And I really love that she explained that to me because a lot of times as child-free people, when we discuss this in a very cisgender, heterosexual way. So I'm very glad that she said that. So when we talk about why this happens, we can look at it in terms of particular religions. Again, humans have so many religions. We just hear about the world's most dominant religions. So, but the world's most dominant religions are not the only religions and spiritualities that go based on this notion that humans have to reproduce. Because we only have documentation of maybe one antinatalist society. And the antinatalist society tend not to exist that long. They only last long if outsiders join their society or they adopt someone into the society.
Yep.
Other than that, the society cannot last long. So as child-free people, we can understand this from a reproductive standpoint. We can understand this as Black people from a cultural standpoint. What it means, it doesn't mean we want all humans to die off, and that will not happen. We still want people to be healthy, long lives. We're not saying we want humans to go extinct in the year 2040. And I really do want Black child-free people to not adopt this anti-baby. I mean, even if children can sometimes be annoying and loud, which is why some people become child-free, we just have to understand that there's some things that you adopt because you join these child-free spaces that are mostly non-Black. But we have to also abandon many of these spaces and get our own spaces like we have done for everything else in our lives, right? What does it mean to have a Black space and to think we don't have to betray our culture, betray our identities to appreciate different life decisions? We can challenge pronatalism without saying you can't stand Black babies. You can challenge pronatalism without ignoring issues regarding Black women who are pregnant and struggling through pregnancy. You can challenge pronatalism without always criticizing Black men. We understand Black patriarchy, but we have to have a discussion of it without adopting the non-Black version of it.
Mhm.
African women have addressed issues regarding men dominance long before women's suffrage, long before feminism existed. So we need to really learn what our people have done for thousands of years before we were told to adopt this other version of women's liberation that comes across as being opposed to our men.
Mhm.
And that's a very important thing that I want Black women, particularly in USA, to understand. We can pick up parts, but as a theorist, I want our people to know we have to increase our own concepts, our own theory, our own research, and our own action as our foundation based on what we've always done as a people. And then we can adopt some outsider stuff. But that cannot be, outsider stuff cannot be the core. Like if you're looking for gender justice, you cannot pretend that gender justice did not exist until we were enslaved, until women's suffrage movement, even though Black women such as my sorority founders were part of the women's suffrage movement. We just can't pretend that this did not exist until that. And so that's just one thing that I want our people to think about when talking about this. Yes, patriarchy does play a role, but we have to understand that the meaning of patriarchy does vary by race as well. Because how do people view control? How do people legitimize control? Historically, what is the role that it takes? Who is the representative for our people? And why is that considered the representative? Because who is a competitive market there? Like, who do people consider the competition? So that's very important from a cultural standpoint as Black women for us to understand that we, as we lead our culture, we can't ignore that we're leading our culture together with people who are not women as well. So from a religious standpoint, religion does matter a lot in this. Gender does matter a lot in this process. But I don't want us to present this as an us versus them. Instead, it's understanding our similarities as a people and how we can come together to make updates together. Because if not, it's a battle. And I love battle rapping. It's old hip hop, but I don't want our people to battle with each other over this when we can actually develop together for this.
Fantastic. So I want to go back to one of the things that you brought up when you were talking about your research about the role that mental health and mental illness plays in
Mhm.
people's decisions to be
Mhm.
child. What did you find around
Yeah, so some Black women who recognize mental illness in family members in themselves say, I'm not going to reiterate this. I'm not going to make this the next generation of our family, especially when Black people in particular have a tendency to not want to go to therapy. And and one thing when I help our people to reach good therapists and support groups is we talk about the difficulty in getting our people to understand that mental health support groups, meditation, whatever people want to use, that's something that you have to actually understand the value of. And you also cannot claim that mental illness did not exist until, I'm gonna say it again, we have to understand mental illnesses have existed since the origins of humans, right?
that?
Because a lot of times when people talk about mental illness, they're acting like, well, we were pure people until those outsiders arrived. And we just have to understand that that's just not how humans are. There's always been diseases, physical diseases, mental diseases. Yes, they've worsened over time, especially with trials and tribulations, but that doesn't mean that we have never had issues. So with child-free Black people who are struggling with mental illness, one sentiment is that why should I pass this on to the next generation? And oftentimes, if you say that to your family's like, well, you should have children. And you're like, well, I don't want to pass this perpetual fibroid tumors, this perpetual, schizophrenia, this perpetual. Usually what people are told is that, well, that's just life.
Right. Yeah.
Have children and they'll figure it out. And unfortunately, I mean, that's very common when I
Yeah.
do mental health presentations. I say it's very common for people to say that life happens, pass on the stuff. And of course, most families don't talk about family history of substance use, suicide, anything. And they just pass it on generation. When people pass away before their time, they don't even have honest discussions of causes of death. And that's the trait that they pass on generation. So when people stop that trait, either because they don't have children or they do have children and now they want to have honest discussions with their children and take their children to doctors, sometimes family members are very offended by both sides.
Right.
First, how dare you not have children? Second, how dare you have children, but now you're having an honest family? Because again, come from a culture where families are told to not tell a whole lot, and possibly for religious reasons, for some gendered reasons as well. And also for some reasons that if you're hiding from the oppressors, you can't reveal too much because, we're hiding from the oppressors. And so among some child-free Black women, that is a concern. It's like they feel like, I don't want to pass this on. I just want to end this cycle here.
Yeah.
The rest of y'all can continue this cycle. I don't want to continue it. I don't want to live the rest of my life having to change that cycle because I brought in a new generation where now I have to engage in the process of changing the cycle when I'm already exhausted, changing the cycle for myself. Why am I now going to take the energy and changing the cycle for myself and now try and change the cycle for my children and possibly for my grandchildren if my child decides to have children? There's some people who just think it doesn't make sense.
Yeah. I'm so clearly agree on that side. It's difficult for me to even imagine the other the other argument. One of the things that you talk about a lot when you talk about the need for diverse conversations in the child-free movement is the fact that and we've talked on this show before about the challenges that child-free, particularly women, because women have the hardest time in the healthcare system, and the particular challenges that child-free women face in healthcare. We know that Black women already face particular both health challenges that go unaddressed and challenges dealing in health medical care medical system, et cetera. So what are some of the specific challenges that child-free women face in the medical space, and how would diversifying this conversation help address those?
Yes. So child-free Black women who are fertile and child-free Black women who are in relationships with particularly men who are also fertile. The question they would have, of course, is having access to birth control if they're sexually active. So making sure that they have access to good birth control that is effective in terms of birth control, but also birth control that does not have intentional and unintentional side effects that can have negative results in the body. That includes, I mean, there's all types of issues regarding certain birth control pills.
Yes.
And there are, of course, people who take certain birth control pills because it balances fibroid tumors. The moment that they stop taking the birth control pills, the fibroid tumors get huge. And so a lot of times gynecologists don't have those conversations with people. So I always tell our people, since I'm the patient, I oftentimes have to reintroduce myself. What I do is I allow medical and health professionals to show me how they are with Black people in general. And then when I see that they don't know what they're doing, and this includes some Black medical and health professionals, I reintroduce myself as who I am professionally. and let them know that in addition to my doing research on this and doing community health equity work, I know how to file patient advocacy complaints as well. Well, this is why I tell people you have to let people know that you're not going to allow this. And this is one thing I tell our people. If you don't read, and when I say read, read beyond just basic internet searches, read beyond social media hashtag stuff. There's actually a lot of research out there. You can find some full peer-reviewed journal articles for health research on a basic internet search, also at libraries. Even if you don't have all the time in the world, I do recommend going into appointments as someone who's ready to take some notes, someone who's asking questions, not because you're trying to battle and argue, because if you come in argumentative, then they're not going to really have an engaging discussion with you. Instead, come in and like, okay, I've been looking at this. And this also happens when talking about tubal ligations. A lot of times, if you have a really good gynecologist, they're not going to preach to you about, you better have children. There are some really good gynecologists who will be prepared to have a really safe tubal ligation without you having to have children. You might come in with all the research because you're ready to have an argument. And the gynecologist is like, I see you printed out all that paperwork. I'm not going to fight you. Look here, we're going to do a safe tubal ligation for you. And unfortunately, of course, emergency hysterectomies happen, especially for Black women with fibroid tumors enlarging, and fibroid tumors run in most of our families, and that's Black women around the world and Black girls around the world. So becoming informed, because sometimes we're prepared for a battle for our lives. And if you have family or friends who want to come to appointments with you, let them know we're coming in informed, to actually listen, to look eye to eye. If they're using big words, if they're showing you something on the computer screen, make them explain it to you using everyday language. That's also what I do when I do trainings and presentations for medical and health students and medical and health professionals. Like if you're showing somebody their uterus, I don't want to hear a four-syllable word. I want you to say, okay, you can say the four-syllable word if that really gasses up your medical ego. Now, though, tell them exactly what it is that they're seeing and explain to them the impact, and explain that if they might need medication, are you going to start with the lowest dose of medication? You're going to do follow-ups, all that stuff. And I tell our people at every time, take notes, like literally write down notes. Look these medical and health professionals eye to eye. A lot of them just don't think that, particularly Black people and Black women, because Black women are in the medical and health appointments more than Black men, they don't think that we're paying attention. They don't think we know a lot. So if something happens to us, it's like, well, you weren't paying attention. So this is where we have to just remember, like I do when I talk about health, education, economics, the decision makers in these roles, they're going to keep doing what they do to get paid or to get voted in office. So it is 100% up to us to go into it, ready to do our part as Black people, to take charge. To take their advice, though, it means that they're going to give us some good, informed, factual advice. And we're going to, if we need a second opinion from another medical and health professional, we can get that as well. We don't have to negate all of their advice, because sometimes negating their advice can have a negative impact on our health. But that's just something that I want Black women to understand. If you want a tubal ligation, if you want anything, of course, emergency hysterectomy, that's something, even non-emergency hysterectomy, that is something that is a desperate last resort. So if you have really good medical and health professionals, they'll have conversations with you. They won't speak with you like you're stupid, but you have to come into this with an understanding that most people are not taught anything about their bodies. Like this is like the lack of sex education in elementary school. So we have grown folks in their 20s, 30s, 40s, even 50s who know nothing about the holes in their genitalia. They know nothing about what's happening inside their body. They know nothing about how babies even happen. These happen. And so medical and health professionals a lot of times get exhausted because they're like, we can't be the sex ed. We can't be the birth education either.
Yeah.
So that's where we as a people have to understand that we have to teach each other and teach ourselves that part, including child-free Black women in particular.
Yeah. Yeah. You said something that I was lucky to have been taught as a child, which is the more empowered you are going into a doctor's office, the more prepared you are, the more questions you have, etc., the more likely you are to get care. So it is so for people to know. So you mentioned running for office, which segued perfectly into my next question, which is when we are looking at the challenges facing child-free women, particularly Black child-free women, what part does politics and policy play into the lives and challenges of child-free Black women, and what kind of policy changes can we be advocating for?
So this is a difficult question because I always tell our people to never rely on politicians and political parties. So voting means that you know that these people will promise a whole lot in their campaign, but they'll do maybe 2% of what they promised. So this is why we as a people, culturally, we've always had to develop our inner world. And we've always had to, it's a form of de-integration in terms of the whole reversal of racial integration, but in a sense of what does it mean when you're still technically integrated, but you're focusing on what are our families going to develop? What are our communities going to develop? What is paid through our taxes that we're going to utilize more of? Because that's part of the work that I do in getting our people to understand, don't frown upon these resources. You're literally paying these resources through your taxes, including poor working class and paycheck to paycheck middle class people. You're paying through your taxes a lot of resources that you're not using, but everyone else is using these resources, including people who make a lot of money. They're using these resources. So if you're not using these resources, but you expect politicians to come and change the world, well, guess what? It's always going to fail. And politicians know that, right? Because they know people are not paying attention either way.
Yes.
So honestly, I don't think that it really matters what Black women say to politicians that we need. It really doesn't matter what we say, because they're not going to ever go based on what Black women say that we need. They always need everybody else to need it. And then what they say is there's going to be a trickle-down effect that helps Black women as well, or Black people as well. But the primary focus is never Black people. We're the trickle-down, whether it's socioeconomic status, whether it's increasing the health system, it's always a trickle-down effect, right? So we can say we want more funds to go into medical and health resources in communities that particularly reach Black people who are poor working class and even paycheck to paycheck middle class. And if they say, okay, what they're going to do is know that we're going to lack peripheral vision and not notice that, okay, we got more money here for this health, but when within walking distance, this daggone city planning committee got this liquor store right here.
Yeah.
And these banks are still giving bank loans for liquor stores and tobacco shops. And now the legalization of marijuana without talking about what it means to have substance use issues that connect with marijuana use and driving around high on marijuana. So they understand that multitasking, they think we're not going to notice. right? So give more access to healthy, safe birth control, but even giving more access to healthy, safe birth control will outrage some of our people because what they'll think about is they'll think about the old school founder of the Planned Parenthood, who her design was on ethnic cleansing, right? And I was on Planned Parenthood committees. Planned Parenthood intentionally changed because they're like, we're not like our founder. Our founder wanted to make sure that poor working class Black people could not have access to this, right? So Planned Parenthood changed that, right? But I say all that because there are going to still be some Black people who say if we have more resources from politicians to address health that includes maybe more access to birth controls, there are going to be some Black people who complain about access to birth controls. From a religious standpoint, from a gender traditional standpoint. So we as a people just have to be honest that there's not going to just be one approach that everyone in our culture is going to find appropriate for our people.
Yes, exactly.
Which is why we have to have safety nets as a people to prepare for anything that comes into effect.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's what other cultures of people do. They don't just rely on this one effort because they know that not everyone in their culture is going to agree with that effort. So now it's what are the safety nets they have?
Yeah.
What are the resources that they've developed as well?
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. So this is all making me really curious. We're going to close with this. You developed the first child-free course. And I'm so curious, A, why you developed it, and B, what did you teach in it? Because I mean, we've barely even scratched the surface of everything that you know and have studied on this.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, I could take 12 courses from you. So tell us a little bit about this course and what it taught, and particularly, you know, if you have thoughts on resources, books, whatever, for people who can't take your course and may want to create their own little course, like where can people go? What do you recommend to learn more?
Yeah, so I created the course at the college where I was faculty in North Carolina. So I'm no longer in North Carolina. So I created that almost 11 years ago. And it was based on this child-free work because my students were so excited because I wanted them to understand how reproduction, when we talk about reproductive rights, it's not just having babies, everybody. Like even when there are reproductive conferences, those of us who are child-free are oftentimes not invited to the conferences because as presenters, because unfortunately, when people talk about reproduction, they don't want to talk about birth control access. They don't want to talk about not having children. They only want to talk about doulas and women having children. So when I created the course, students were familiar with my research because my work study student was transcribing the interviews and I was still doing the research. And my students used to always come out of my office like, Dr. Dennis, who are you talking to today? And some of my students actually participated in the research because they themselves were child-free. And so when I taught the course, what they did is we discussed some sociology terms that they learned in their other courses. And we used some child-free readings and child-free websites that you've seen me do guest writings in, and talked about child-free interviews and had really good discussions about what does it mean to have freedom and to not be outraged that some people's choices are different than yours. So students were able to do presentations. Some students already had children. Some students were planning to have children. And some students who had children were honest that they just wished that they had more resources so that they could have had someone to help them instead of just saying, well, you're a woman, you'll figure it out.
Yeah.
So that's one important factor. And there are some people who've contacted me over the years, and I explained that there's not really a child-free textbook to use, but there are sociology books, they're medical books that include components of child-free. So like when I teach sociology of family, I have a part where I add my child-free research in there because we talk about how we shape family to include those of us who are child free, because people always will tell us, well, you're not going to have a family. Oh, I just landed on this earth. I don't know how I got here,
I know.
Again,
That always mystifies me. I'm like, you're right. I have no mother, no siblings. I hatched from an egg. And
we don't have any connections with people. And that's, again, in sociology and marriage and family and sociology and family courses, we talk about this. Family is something that we as humans create. We have cultures around the world for hundreds of thousands of years where they define family in different ways. It's not always biological children. And the history of marriage and the history of having children varies by cultures as well. Talking about owning property, who's going to work this land, is all types of things. It's not always been this whole we love each other design that people see on Hallmark Channel. And so it's just some of those things that in teaching the course, students appreciate that. So anyone can contact me and we can discuss the types of materials to use. Just make sure the demographics and cultures represented. Since I created an academic program, it was a criminal studies program. As a criminologist, I integrate criminal justice, criminology, psychology as well with that. And one thing I do is I specialize in curriculum development and evaluations for program evaluations for accreditation. So one of the things I do is I show people how to evaluate the materials they're using in libraries and in courses and academic programs. So if you're going to create a child-free course, or any course, but especially a child-free course in this circumstance, look in the reference page, the works cited page, look everywhere. Who's represented in the authors? If it's women, okay, it can't be white women represent all women, okay? Because that goes back to this whole notion that always happens. We're talking about disabilities. It's white people representing everyone with a disability. You can talk about from a religious standpoint, who represents religious variants. So if you're going to create a child-free course, who's going to be represented in the readings? Who's going to be represented in the voices that you want your students to hear? And also look at shade of melanin, talking about colorism issues. It can't just be people with the lightest melanin. It can't be light, bright people. It has to be the full span, and hair texture. All of that matters because people think it doesn't matter, but it actually does, because we're talking about challenging this narrow view of which type of people choose certain life decisions. Because you'll oftentimes see people who respond to me like, you're child free, you're going against your African origins. I says, well, you don't understand African origins then. Like, we are a full span of people. And that's the thing about African liberation, is understanding that full span and not feeling like there's just one culture. After hundreds of thousands of years, it's just one culture and one choice in that culture. And so anyone who creates a child-free course has to be prepared to design a course in a way that they evaluate all the materials and challenge their own assumptions to get beyond the group that's oftentimes the biggest voice in child-free work.
Yeah. Well, and that is valuable information for anyone trying to start any kind of course, frankly.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, but particularly this. Well, Dr. Dennis, thank you so much. I've learned so much. This is so interesting. I now want to Google all of your research again and read even more. This was really, really helpful and wonderful. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for being amazing as always.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and of course, leave a review. Until next week, here's hoping you find joy in your solo life.